Today we are looking at James chapter 4, verses 4 to 10. Here's how it starts. You adulterous people. It's always a way to get your attention, right? Calling a group of people adulterers. It's a big and heavy word. What is James on about by calling his audience an adulterous people? Well, let's keep reading. He says, "Don't you know that friendship with the world means hostility or enmity toward God? Therefore, anyone who chooses to be a friend with the world becomes an enemy of God." This is James's premise here. He's talking to a group of believers and, again, is sort of hammering home what he thinks are the most important instructions for this Christian community to live by. James is only a few short chapters, and so essentially we can view the whole letter of James as what he, as the pastor of this church, thinks is the most important things that Christians ought to know and live by. And so James starts out this section wanting his church community to know that they ought to be distinguished from the rest of the world. That being a follower of Jesus means that you don't look and act like anyone else anymore. Now, most of us know that in principle. We might even agree to it in principle, but the practice of it is much, much harder. The idea of friendship, James uses the word philia, the Greek word philos, which means this loyal, devoted friendship. It's the type of friendships that we get in with our best mates, those that we want to spend time with, and we share things in common, and we enjoy hanging out with them. And James is saying that when we do that with the world, the culture, the value, the ways of the world, that we decide, this is the type of friend I want to associate with, that I want to hang out with, that I enjoy spending time with. James says, you are similar to someone who's committing adultery. In fact, he says that, don't you know that friendship with the world means that you are an enemy of God? Those things are not compatible. You can't be a friend of the world and be God's friend. They're mutually exclusive. So then, what's his advice? Well, James goes on to say, verse 5, that God longs jealously for us, for the Spirit within us, that he longs for us to be his friend. He doesn't want to share us with the world. And that's why, he goes on to say, verse 6, God wants to give us grace. God enables us and helps us when we turn to him to help us to be his friend, rather than people that associate with the world and want to be friends with the world and find our value with what the world says is valuable. So how do we do that? How do we turn from being friends with the world toward being friends with God? Well, this is where verses 7 to 10 come in. James gives a series of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 different imperatives, instructions, commands of what that looks like. So here's what he says. Number 1, submit yourselves then to God. 2, resist the devil and he will flee from you. 3, come near to God and he will come near to you. 4, wash your hands, you sinners. And 5, purify your hearts, you double-minded. 6, grieve. 7, mourn. 8, wail. 9, change your laughter to mourning. 10, and your gloom to joy. And 11, humble yourself before the Lord, and he will lift you up. This language is used throughout, especially not just the New Testament, but the Old in particular. In the Old Testament, we see these pictures of when people finally understand that they have been friends with the world. They've been paying attention to what the world says, what else is out there, and finding their value and placing their worship and their trust in things that aren't eternal. and they realize, they've had this moment where they come to grips that they've done the wrong thing. This is sort of the language that gets used. This like deep, heart-wrenching change that happens within them. And many times in the Old Testament, the language is that someone just rips their clothes, right? They rip their clothes and they fall on their knees. They humble themselves. They sometimes put on sack and ash over themselves as this signifying that I've royally messed up. And God, I need to get right with you and put you as the center again. So I'm making myself nothing. And this is the language that James uses, that if you find yourself as a friend, more as a friend to the world than you do being God's friend, you ought to make a radical change, to submit yourself, to run away from those things that you put your value in that aren't eternal, to draw near to God, to cleanse yourself, to make yourself right again, and to understand the depth of where you've fallen, to grieve, mourn, and wail, and to humble yourself, to admit to God you've gotten it wrong. Now, the rub is that most of us might be considered friends of the world, right? We place our value in things that don't eternally matter, about how many friends that we have on social media, or how open our planned living is in our home, or whatever, or money, or comfort, or our health, right? And we value what the world values rather than what God does. And if that's the case, James wants you and I to know that that's a serious mistake, that we ought to be people who are only on about wanting to live for and please God, that he is the one who gives us grace. He is the one who lifts us up. He is the one that is the only one who's will last forever. So maybe today is a moment that you stop. You rend your clothes because you realize you've been too associated with the world, its values, and placing your trust and worship in that rather than God. And if that's you, we would love to chat and wrestle through that with you and talk about my own areas of my life where I need to submit myself and humble myself before God. So let's take this seriously and be God's people who are his friend, rather than friends with things that don't last and aren't out to make us better human beings. See ya.